The man I'd called Uncle Ray since I was 7 years old stood at my parents' dining table and told them their retirement savings had just about doubled in his private fund. I believed him for 11 years. It took me 3 weeks with a forensic accountant to prove that the fund had never actually existed at all. Before I take you through exactly how I found that out, and I promise you, the deeper this goes, the more unbelievable it gets. If this is your first time here, welcome to Kaynaat Revenge. Every week, I bring you real, raw stories about the people who betray the trust we give them most freely, and the moment that trust finally gets tested against the truth. This is a long, layered story tonight, so settle in, get comfortable, and let it play in the background if you need to. This one's worth every minute. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever trusted someone specifically because you'd known them your whole life, only to find out that history was the very thing they were counting on. Hit subscribe, because this story is going to show you exactly what it takes to unravel a lie that's had decades to harden into something that looks like family. All right, let's go back to where Ray Kessler first became part of ours. My name is Laura Mitchell. I was 39 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona, working as a marketing consultant, married with 2 teenagers, and for as long as I could remember, Ray Kessler had been Uncle Ray, not a blood relative, but my father's closest friend since their 20s, a man who'd been at every birthday party, every graduation, every major moment of my life since before I could form memories of my own. My father, Tom, and Ray had met as young men working their first jobs together at an insurance company in the early 1980s. 2 junior claims adjusters sharing a cramped office and, according to family legend, a truly terrible second-hand coffee maker that neither of them could bring themselves to throw away. Their friendship had outlasted both of their careers at that company, several cross-country moves as they each climbed into better jobs, my father's transfer to Phoenix when I was 3, and Ray's decision, a few years later, to follow with his own young family rather than let the distance quietly end something he clearly valued as much as my father did. Eventually, Ray transitioned into financial advising, building what became, over nearly 3 decades, a genuinely respected local practice specializing in retirement planning for a client base that, over the years, became almost entirely made up of people from our extended community. My parents' church congregation, family friends, eventually, as I got older, colleagues and acquaintances of my own who'd been introduced to Ray through my parents' glowing, entirely sincere recommendations. I want to paint a fuller picture of who Ray actually was in our lives, because I think it matters to understanding how thoroughly this all worked. He was, by every measure I understood at the time, exactly what he appeared to be. He drove a reasonable, unflashy sedan, the kind of car that never once made anyone wonder how a financial advisor could afford it. He and his wife, Diane, lived in a comfortable but genuinely modest house not far from my parents, the kind of house where the furniture looked lived in rather than staged. He coached a youth baseball team for years after his own kids had aged out of it. Simply, he always said, because he liked being around kids and baseball, and I have specific, warm memories of him coaching my own younger cousins on summer evenings, patient in a way that never once felt performed. He remembered small details about everyone in a way that felt genuinely attentive rather than calculated. He'd ask about a specific class I was struggling with in college, a full year after I'd mentioned it in passing at a barbecue, and actually remember how it had turned out. Looking back now, with everything I know, I've had to sit with the uncomfortable, complicated understanding that this specific talent, remembering people, making them feel individually seen and valued, was probably the single most important tool in the entire scheme, and I genuinely don't know, even now, how much of it was calculated and how much of it was simply who Ray actually was, layered underneath everything else he became. I think about his own children sometimes, 2 adult sons I'd known casually growing up, both of whom, as far as anyone in our family has been able to determine since, had no involvement in or knowledge of what their father was doing. One of them, the older son, reached out to my mother personally about 2 months after everything became public, an unbearably difficult phone call by every account, apologizing for something he hadn't done and couldn't have prevented, asking if there was anything he could do, though there genuinely wasn't. My mother has described that call to me several times since, always with the same specific mixture of grief and unexpected tenderness. A reminder, she says, that the damage from something like this doesn't stay contained to the people who did it and the people they directly stole from. It moves outward into an entire web of relationships that had nothing to do with any of it, quietly reshaping all of them at once. When my father retired at 65, 12 years ago, after spending nearly 4 decades building a career, first in insurance and later in regional operations management, it felt like the most natural thing in the world that Ray would be the one managing the retirement savings my parents had spent that entire working life building, a decision made with the kind of complete, unquestioning trust that I now understand had been built, deliberately and patiently, over almost 30 years of genuine friendship before a single dollar of retirement money ever formally changed hands. About 11 years ago, roughly a year after my father retired, Ray approached my parents with what he described as a specialized opportunity, a private investment fund he'd developed, available only to a select group of long-term clients he trusted personally, offering returns that, he explained over what my mother remembers as an unusually long, careful dinner conversation, came from a diversified mix of real estate development projects and private equity positions unavailable through standard retail investment channels. He called it, with what I now recognize as a carefully chosen note of humility, just something I put together for people I actually care about, not something I'd ever offer to a stranger. My mother has told me, more than once since all of this came out, that what convinced her wasn't the promised returns themselves, which were modest and believable rather than flashy, but the specific feeling of being let into something private and personal, something that felt less like a sales pitch and more like being trusted with a secret. My parents moved the bulk of their retirement savings, just over $400,000, representing nearly all of what they'd built over their working lives, into Ray's private fund over the following 2 years, drawn by both the promised returns and, more than anything, by the specific, powerful comfort of trusting their money to someone who felt less like a financial advisor and more like family. I want to be honest that I felt that same comfort myself. When my husband and I came into a modest inheritance from his grandmother about 6 years ago, we discussed, briefly, whether to put a portion of it into Uncle Ray's fund as well, ultimately deciding against it only because our own financial advisor, unrelated to Ray, recommended a different allocation strategy for our specific situation. A decision that, in hindsight, I now understand may have quietly protected us from becoming direct victims ourselves, even as it did absolutely nothing to protect my parents. I want to describe one specific memory because I think it captures better than almost anything else how thoroughly Ray had woven himself into the actual texture of our family life, not just its finances. 2 years after my parents first invested, my father had a minor cardiac scare. Nothing life-threatening, as it turned out, but frightening enough in the moment that my mother called Ray before she called me, purely out of instinct, because Ray had become, over the decades, the person she reflexively reached for during a crisis. He drove to the hospital that night, sat with my mother in the waiting room for 4 hours, and never once, in any conversation afterward, mentioned anything about the fund or their finances, which, at the time, I understood as simply further proof of what a genuinely good friend he was. I understand it very differently now. A man capable of running a 14-year fraud against people he loved was also, unmistakably, exactly the kind of person who understood precisely how much a gesture like that would deepen the trust he was quietly, systematically exploiting. My mother has also told me, since everything came out, about smaller moments I hadn't known about. A Christmas Eve years ago when Ray noticed she seemed quietly stressed and, without being asked, spent 20 minutes walking her through the fund's most recent statement at her own kitchen table, patiently explaining each line in a way that made her feel more secure rather than less, precisely because nothing about how he did it ever suggested urgency or evasion. Looking back at that memory now, she says, is one of the strangest parts of the entire aftermath, trying to hold two completely incompatible versions of the same man in her mind at once. The one who spent 20 unhurried minutes making her feel safe, and the one who had already, by that point, been lying to her for years. For 11 years, the fund appeared, through the quarterly statements Ray personally prepared and reviewed with my parents over dinner, almost always at their own dining table, in a tradition that had become a genuinely warm, anticipated part of their relationship. Ray would arrive with a bottle of wine, my mother would make her pot roast, and the actual financial review itself often took up less time than the conversation and laughter surrounding it. To perform steadily and impressively, modest but consistent annual returns that, according to those statements, had grown my parents' original investment to just over $750,000 by the time everything I'm about to tell you finally came to light. My parents had, over those 11 years, made real decisions based on those numbers, delaying a planned kitchen renovation twice because Ray had gently suggested, based on fund liquidity considerations, that it might be better to wait a year. Decisions that felt, at the time, like the ordinary, sensible caution of a good advisor looking out for their long-term interests. I want to walk you through exactly how this began to unravel, because it started with something almost embarrassingly small, the kind of detail that's easy to miss even when you're looking directly at it. About 4 months ago, my mother mentioned, during an otherwise unremarkable phone call, that she and my father wanted to withdraw a portion of the fund, around $60,000, to help cover an unexpected roof replacement after a bad summer storm, and to assist my brother Kevin with a down payment on his first house. She mentioned it almost as an aside, clearly not anticipating any complication, since the quarterly statements had always shown more than enough liquidity to easily accommodate a withdrawal of that size, and Ray had, over the years, processed smaller withdrawals without any issue at all. The complication came about 10 days later, when my mother called again, this time with a slight, unfamiliar edge of confusion in her voice. Ray had told her the withdrawal would take a little longer than usual to process due to some of the underlying real estate positions being in an illiquid period right now, an explanation that, on its own, sounded plausible enough. Private real estate investments genuinely can have liquidity constraints, and I want to be honest that even I, hearing this secondhand, didn't feel any real alarm at first. But when I asked my mother, mostly out of simple curiosity rather than any real suspicion at that point, exactly what those underlying positions were, she realized, a little sheepishly, that she'd never actually seen the fund's holdings itemized in any detail beyond the summary performance figures on Ray's quarterly statements. 11 years of dinners, 11 years of warm, reassuring conversation, and neither of my parents had ever once asked to see an actual itemized breakdown of what the fund actually held. I offered, casually, to help her request a more detailed breakdown, framing it to my parents as simple due diligence rather than anything more alarming, since I genuinely didn't suspect, at that point, anything beyond an unusually cautious fund manager being slow with paperwork during a busy season. When my mother relayed the request to Ray, his response, she told me, was warm but notably vague. He'd put together something comprehensive for her soon. He just needed a little time to pull the full documentation together, given how the fund is structured across several entities. Something about that specific phrase, several entities, sat oddly with me, in a way I couldn't fully articulate at first, and I want to be honest that I let almost a full week pass without acting on that unease, partly out of a reluctance I now recognize in myself to look too closely at someone I loved and trusted that completely. I've spent enough of my career working with financial and real estate clients through my marketing consulting work to have picked up a passing familiarity with how legitimate private funds are typically structured and documented, and the vagueness of Ray's explanation felt, the more I turned it over in my mind, less like genuine complexity and more like a specific kind of stalling I'd occasionally seen, at a much smaller scale, from clients trying to avoid answering a direct question about their finances during a project review. I did something, about 2 weeks later, that I want to be honest felt almost like a betrayal of my own. I looked up Ray's investment advisory registration through the SEC's Public Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database, a resource I only knew about because of prior work with financial services clients. Sitting at my kitchen counter late one night after my kids had gone to bed, telling myself the entire time that I was just being thorough, that I'd find some perfectly reasonable explanation and feel silly for having looked it all. What I found instead was the first real, concrete crack in 11 years of unquestioned trust. Ray's registered advisory practice, the legitimate business that managed standard retirement accounts for his broader client base, had no registered private fund associated with it at all. Whatever Uncle Ray's fund actually was, it existed, at least as far as any formal regulatory record showed, entirely outside any officially registered or disclosed investment vehicle. I sat at that counter for a long time that night, feeling a very specific, sick kind of doubt settle into my stomach. Not full certainty yet that anything was wrong, but enough of a genuine question that I understood I couldn't simply let it go. I hired a forensic accountant the following week, a careful, thorough woman named Sandra Wu, who came recommended through a colleague who'd used her during a business dispute, initially telling my parents only that I wanted to help them get a clearer, more organized picture of their investments. A framing I chose deliberately, because some instinct in me understood that I needed real evidence before I said anything that might alarm them, or, more importantly, might reach Ray before I fully understood what I was actually dealing with. Sandra's initial review, working from the quarterly statements my mother provided along with whatever bank records we could access through my parents' own online banking, took about 3 weeks. She was methodical in a way that, looking back, I'm deeply grateful for. She didn't rush to conclusions, walking me through each finding carefully, explaining what it meant, and what additional information would help confirm or rule it out, treating what could have been an overwhelming, chaotic process with a kind of steady clinical calm that helped me stay functional through what quickly became one of the most disorienting periods of my life. What she found dismantled 11 years of my family's trust in a way I still find difficult to fully describe, even now. The fund had no independent custodian, meaning no third-party financial institution, the kind legitimate investment funds are legally required to use specifically to prevent exactly this kind of fraud, ever actually held or verified the underlying assets. All of the money my parents had invested had, instead, been deposited directly into accounts that Ray personally controlled, accounts with names generic enough, Kessler Capital Holdings, Desert Legacy Partners, that they had never once raised a flag in 11 years of casual mention on a quarterly statement. The quarterly statements themselves, rather than reflecting actual investment performance, appeared to Sandra, based on the patterns she identified across formatting inconsistencies and rounding irregularities, that a genuine, third-party audited fund simply wouldn't show, to be manually generated documents showing whatever growth figures Ray chose to report each quarter. More devastating still, Sandra's deeper dive into the available banking records, obtained, over the following weeks, through formal requests once we understood the scale of what we were investigating, revealed that new client deposits, from other families in our community who had also trusted Ray with their retirement savings over the years, were being used to fund the withdrawal requests of earlier investors, a structure Sandra identified immediately, with grim clarity, as a classic Ponzi scheme, the exact kind she told me she'd unfortunately seen several times before in her career, always with the same devastating pattern of aging victims and decades of relationship trust. My parents' original $400,000 hadn't been invested anywhere at all. Some portion of it had likely gone toward supporting Ray's own lifestyle over the years, and much of the rest had likely been used to pay out earlier withdrawal requests from other trusting families, keeping the entire scheme afloat only as long as new money kept flowing in faster than existing investors wanted their money back out. A fragile, unsustainable structure that Sandra explained always, eventually, collapses, the only real variable being when. Sandra walked me through the mechanics of it slowly, on a video call one evening, sharing her screen so I could see the actual account activity for myself rather than simply taking her word for it, which I appreciated even as it made everything feel more devastatingly real. She showed me how, in the months before my parents made their original investment 11 years ago, a cluster of withdrawal requests from earlier clients had gone out almost immediately after new deposits came in. Not the pattern of a fund making measured, considered investment decisions, but the pattern, she explained, of someone essentially juggling incoming and outgoing cash just quickly enough to keep the whole structure from visibly collapsing. She pointed out specific months, years apart, where the timing was almost too precise to be coincidental. A withdrawal request from one family processed within days of a substantial new deposit from another, over and over, a rhythm that, once you saw it laid out chronologically, became impossible to unsee. I asked her, during that same call, how long she thought Ray could have kept this going if my mother's roof hadn't needed replacing, if that one ordinary, unremarkable withdrawal request had never happened at all. Sandra was quiet for a moment before answering honestly that she genuinely didn't know, but that schemes like this tend to end in one of only a few ways: a large enough withdrawal request that the operator simply can't cover, a whistleblower, a regulatory audit triggered by something unrelated, or the operator's own death or incapacitation suddenly exposing everything to whoever inherits the mess. There was no scenario, she said, where it simply continued indefinitely. It was always, eventually, going to collapse. The only real question was how many more families would be pulled in, and how much further along toward genuine destitution my own parents and the others already inside it would be, before that happened. The $750,000 my parents believed they had, the number that had appeared, warmly and reassuringly, on 11 years of quarterly statements delivered personally over dinner at their own dining table, simply didn't exist anywhere in any real, verifiable form. I want to be honest about the specific, layered nature of what broke in me during this period, because it wasn't a single moment the way some betrayals are. It unfolded slowly, over the 3 weeks Sandra spent building her initial findings, each new piece of evidence landing like its own small, separate collapse: the missing custodian, the generic named accounts, the formatting inconsistencies in the statements, each one requiring me to sit with a fresh wave of the same disbelief before I could move forward to the next. I remember, specifically, the evening Sandra first explained the concept of a Ponzi scheme to me in concrete, personal terms, rather than as an abstract financial crime category I understood only vaguely from news stories about strangers in other cities. She asked me, carefully, whether I knew of any other families who might also be invested with Ray, and I remember the specific, sinking realization, sitting in my car in my own driveway after that call, that I could immediately think of at least 4 or 5 families without even trying hard. people from my parents' church, old family friends, people who had, like my parents, been drawn in by decades of genuine relationship rather than any aggressive sales pitch. The actual breaking point, though, came when Sandra's expanded review, working from limited additional records, two of those families agreed to informally share once I reached out to them carefully. Identified at least 6 other families within our community, people from my parents' church, 2 of my own childhood friends' parents, a couple my parents had known for over 20 years, people whose kids I'd grown up alongside at church potlucks and summer barbecues, who appeared, based on patterns in the limited banking records we could access before any formal investigation began, to be current investors in the same scheme, their retirement savings just as precariously dependent on new money continuing to flow in as my own parents had been. I remember sitting with Sandra's preliminary report, understanding for the first time the full scope of what Ray had actually built. Not a single, isolated betrayal of my parents specifically, but a systemic fraud that had, for years, deliberately targeted an entire community of people who trusted him precisely because of decades of carefully cultivated, genuine-seeming relationships. Every dinner at my parents' dining table, every warm quarterly review of fabricated returns, every youth baseball season he'd coached, building goodwill and trust throughout our broader community, I understood, sitting with that report, that all of it had, at some point, become raw material for a fraud that could collapse at any moment and take dozens of retirement-age families down with it. Families with far less financial cushion than my own parents to absorb a loss of this scale. I confronted Ray, once, before formally engaging attorneys or regulators, though I want to be clear this wasn't a strategic choice, so much as a moment I couldn't fully control, a rare loss of composure in a process I'd otherwise been trying to handle with as much careful deliberation as I could manage. I called him directly, late on a Thursday evening, told him what Sandra had found, and asked him, point blank, whether the fund actually existed in any real form. There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped, before he said, in a voice that had lost every trace of the warm, familiar Uncle Ray tone I'd known my entire life, a voice that suddenly sounded old and tired in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. Laura, I need you to understand I never meant for it to get this big. I was going to make it right eventually. I just needed more time. That admission, not an outright denial, but a tired, resigned confirmation that 11 years of my parents' trust, and years of trust from families across our entire community, had been built on something he'd known, at some point, had stopped being real, is the moment my grief fully converted into resolve. I told him I needed to go, hung up the phone with hands that I remembered distinctly were shaking, and called Sandra and, immediately after, an attorney, understanding clearly that I was no longer simply trying to help my parents get a clearer accounting of their own money. I was trying to stop an active, ongoing fraud before it could claim any more of the people I'd grown up trusting him alongside. I hired a securities fraud attorney named Michael Torres, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, investment fraud targeting retirement-age communities, a specialty, he told me during our first meeting, that had become depressingly common enough to sustain a significant part of his practice, though he was quick to add, with genuine kindness, that he still found each individual case just as difficult as the first one he'd ever worked. Michael was direct about the path forward, given the scale of what Sandra had already documented, and the real, ongoing risk to other families still actively invested, this needed to move on two tracks simultaneously: a civil action to recover whatever assets could still be recovered, and, just as urgently, formal reports to both the SEC and the FBI, since a scheme of this scale, actively defrauding new victims to pay off previous ones, was exactly the kind of ongoing harm regulators needed to act on quickly. Michael's very first, urgent question to me was whether Ray had any specific reason yet to believe federal or regulatory action was actually coming, as opposed to simply knowing that I, personally, had caught him. I explained that as far as I could tell, Ray believed this was still contained to an uncomfortable conversation with me, and, by extension, my parents. He had no way of knowing about Sandra's forensic work, the other families I'd quietly begun reaching out to, or that an attorney was already involved. Michael told me this mattered enormously. Schemes like this, in his experience, rarely trigger an immediate flight response from the person running them the moment one investor figures it out, particularly when that investor is someone as personally close as I was to him. Operators in Ray's position, he explained, tend to keep functioning largely as normal for as long as possible, continuing to reassure other clients, continuing to make small payments to preserve the appearance of stability, because fleeing outright is itself a costly, difficult, and irreversible decision that confirms guilt in a way many people delay as long as they possibly can. Still, Michael was clear that this gave us a real but limited window, and that everything about our timeline from that point forward needed to move as efficiently as the actual evidence gathering allowed, precisely because that window wouldn't stay open indefinitely. The hardest part of this preparation, honestly, wasn't the legal strategy itself, but the delicate, painful work of reaching out to the other families Sandra had identified, people I'd known most of my life, who had no idea yet that the retirement savings they believed were safely growing in Ray's care had, in reality, been part of a collapsing scheme for years. I remember the specific dread of making those first calls, starting with the Hendersons, a couple my parents had known since before I was born, sitting in their own kitchen listening to me explain, as gently as I possibly could, why I was asking careful, specific questions about their own investments with Ray. Mrs. Henderson cried on that call, and I remember apologizing to her repeatedly, even though I understood, rationally, that I wasn't the one who had done anything wrong. I want to describe that call in a little more detail, because it set the tone for almost every conversation that followed it. Mr. Henderson, a retired high school teacher who'd coached alongside Ray on that same youth baseball team for 2 full seasons, kept circling back, again and again, to specific memories. A time Ray had driven 3 hours to attend his retirement party, a fishing trip they'd taken together the summer after Mr. Henderson's own wife passed away, when Ray had, by his account, simply shown up at the dock with 2 rods and a cooler and refused to let him sit home alone with his grief. I remember sitting with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to a genuinely kind, intelligent man try to reconcile those specific memories with what I was telling him, and understanding, in that moment, exactly how much harder this was going to be for families who didn't have the benefit I'd had of already spending 3 disorienting weeks with Sandra, slowly building up the evidence piece by piece before the full weight of it landed all at once. The Alvarezes took the news differently, more immediately practical, less emotionally raw in that first conversation, though I later learned that Mrs. Alvarez had gone out to her car afterward and sat there for nearly an hour before going back inside to tell her husband. They'd invested a smaller amount than my parents, just under $90,000, but it represented, as Mr. Alvarez told me quietly, basically everything we had left over after the kids' college. A phrase that has stayed with me since, because it captured so precisely the specific, quiet devastation of affinity fraud. Not reckless people chasing extraordinary returns, but ordinary, careful people who had simply, reasonably, trusted the wrong person with money they genuinely couldn't afford to lose. Working closely with Michael, we developed a careful, deliberate approach, rather than alarming everyone simultaneously, which risked either panicking Ray into fleeing or causing a chaotic, uncoordinated run on whatever remaining assets existed, which could have made recovery significantly harder for everyone involved. We identified two other families, the Hendersons and another couple, the Alvarezes, longtime friends of my parents from church, willing to work quietly and directly with Michael and Sandra, building a broader, more complete picture of the fraud's true scale before any formal action was filed. Sandra, meanwhile, expanded her forensic work significantly, working with Michael to formally subpoena banking records once the civil case was filed, which allowed a far more complete reconstruction than the limited records we'd initially been able to access through informal cooperation alone. Her final analysis, completed over roughly 5 weeks of painstaking work, cross-referencing account openings, deposit timing, withdrawal patterns, and the specific language used across years of quarterly statements, documented a scheme that had operated for just over 14 years, beginning several years before my own parents had ever been approached, defrauding at least 11 families of a combined total exceeding $3 million, with the vast majority of the original invested capital either spent directly by Ray on personal expenses, including, we discovered during this expanded review, a second property in Sedona that existed nowhere on any financial disclosure he'd ever made to my parents or any other client, purchased under a name that took Sandra nearly a week of careful tracing to definitively connect back to him, or used to pay out earlier withdrawal requests in the classic, unsustainable structure of a Ponzi scheme. Michael filed the civil complaint on behalf of my parents and the two other participating families, seeking recovery of the fraudulently obtained funds, along with damages, timed carefully to coincide with formal referrals to both the SEC's Enforcement Division and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Given the clear federal wire fraud implications of a scheme operating across bank accounts and involving victims making decisions based on fabricated documents sent, in some cases, electronically over the years, as Ray had gradually modernized parts of his communication with clients. During this 6-week preparation period, I made the difficult decision, on Michael's strong advice, not to tell my parents the full scope of what we'd uncovered until the legal and regulatory actions were far enough along that there was no meaningful risk of the full extent of the investigation, the other families, the forensic report, the pending SEC and FBI referrals, leaking back to Ray through an emotional, well-intentioned conversation before authorities could act. Ray already knew I personally suspected something was wrong. What he couldn't know yet was how much we'd already built, or how many other people were quietly involved. I told my parents only that we'd identified some serious irregularities that required a formal investigation, a partial truth that weighed on me heavily throughout this period. I remember specifically the discomfort of sitting across from my mother at her own dining table, the same table where Ray had delivered 11 years of fabricated reassurance. And having to hold back the full truth from her a little longer, even as I understood, intellectually, why Michael and Sandra both believed this was necessary to protect both the integrity of the eventual case and the remaining families whose retirement savings still hung in the balance. I also spent a significant part of this period simply managing my own emotional state well enough to function, continuing to show up for my kids, for my consulting clients, for the ordinary daily texture of a life that felt, underneath the surface, like it had been quietly rearranged around something enormous I couldn't yet talk about with almost anyone. My husband was, throughout this entire period, an anchor in a way I don't think I fully appreciated until much later. The one person outside the small circle of Michael, Sandra, and the two cooperating families who knew the full truth, and who never once made me feel like the weight of carrying it quietly was unreasonable to ask of myself. There's a particular evening from this period I still think about often. My parents had invited Ray and Diane over for their usual dinner, an arrangement my mother had made weeks earlier, before any of this began, and Michael was firm that canceling it abruptly could risk tipping Ray off that something was wrong. So I sat at that same dining table, 3 weeks into knowing my family's entire retirement had likely been stolen, watching Ray pour wine and tell an easy, familiar story about a fishing trip, watching my mother laugh at exactly the moment she always laughed at that particular kind of story, and understanding that I was, for those 2 hours, performing a version of normalcy more demanding than almost anything I'd ever done in my life. I remember excusing myself to the bathroom at one point, simply to sit on the edge of the tub for a few minutes, steadying my breathing, before going back out to finish the evening as though nothing in the world had changed. Looking back, I think that dinner, more than almost anything else in this entire story, is what finally, fully convinced me of exactly how capable Ray was of sustaining a lie across an ordinary, loving evening, because I watched myself do something similar that same night, for entirely different reasons, and understood, watching him, that he'd clearly had far more practice. The formal actions moved forward within the same coordinated week. Michael's civil complaint was filed in Arizona Superior Court. The SEC opened a formal enforcement investigation based on Sandra's forensic documentation, and the FBI, working in parallel given the clear evidence of wire fraud across state lines through some of Ray's electronic banking activity, began building a criminal case. I want to walk you through the day everything became fully public, because it's a day I imagine every family involved in this story will remember, with a similarly strange, layered mixture of vindication and grief. FBI agents, executing a search warrant supported by Sandra's forensic analysis and Michael's civil filing, arrived at Ray's office on a Tuesday morning, seizing financial records, computers, and documentation that ultimately confirmed and expanded everything Sandra had already found. I heard about it first from Mrs. Henderson, who called me in tears, having driven past Ray's office that same morning and seen the federal vehicles parked outside. Within days, as word spread through our tight-knit community, impossible to fully contain once federal agents had visibly executed a search warrant at a well-known local financial advisor's office, the remaining families Sandra hadn't yet identified began coming forward, some contacting Michael's office directly after seeing local news coverage, ultimately bringing the total confirmed victim count to 17 families and total losses to just over $4.1 million. I remember sitting with my parents the evening the news became public, finally telling them the complete truth, not just about the irregularities I'd previously mentioned, but the full scope of what Sandra had documented: the 14 years, the Ponzi structure, the fabricated statements delivered warmly across their own dining table for over a decade. I watched my father, a man I had never once seen, cry in my entire life. Not at his own mother's funeral, not at either of my children's births, sit quietly at that same dining table and grieve. Not just the money, though the financial loss was genuinely devastating, but the specific, irreplaceable loss of more than 40 years of friendship that he now had to understand, entirely and permanently, had been used against him and against his family in the most calculated way imaginable. My mother, for her part, kept asking the same question in different forms throughout that evening, not about the money, but about whether any of it, any single dinner, any single moment of genuine seeming warmth over 4 decades, had been real at all, a question I genuinely couldn't answer for her, and one I don't think any of us have fully resolved even now. My brother Kevin took the news differently than either of our parents, and I think it's worth mentioning, because grief inside a single family rarely moves in just one direction. He'd been in the middle of closing on his first house when the $60,000 withdrawal our parents had planned to help with simply never arrived, and I remember the specific, difficult conversation where I had to explain to him not just that the money wasn't coming, but why, that the man who'd taught him to throw a curveball at age 9 had also, somewhere along the way, been quietly stealing from their parents for years. Kevin's anger, in the early weeks, was sharper and more immediate than mine had been, less tempered by the specific process of slowly discovering the truth, piece by piece, the way I had. He eventually found his own way to a version of the same resolve I'd reached, becoming, over the following months, one of the most active members of the informal group of victim families that had started forming, helping coordinate a shared spreadsheet of court dates and filings that several of us still jokingly refer to as the world's worst family newsletter. Word reached the rest of our extended family and our parents' broader church community in waves over that first week, and I want to be honest that navigating those conversations, over and over, telling essentially the same devastating story to person after person who'd known Ray for years, became its own specific kind of exhausting grief. Our pastor, who had personally introduced at least 2 of the eventual victim families to Ray over the years, offered a genuinely moving apology to the congregation the following Sunday, one that acknowledged, without excusing anything, how thoroughly community trust itself had been turned into part of the mechanism of the fraud. Several people afterward told me, quietly, that they'd considered investing with Ray themselves at some point over the years and had simply never gotten around to it. A specific, uncomfortable kind of near miss that several families sat with in their own way during those first raw weeks. The civil case moved forward over the following several months, running parallel to the criminal investigation. Michael was able to identify and freeze several remaining assets before Ray could dissipate them further, including the previously undisclosed Sedona property, which Ray's own attorney, facing overwhelming forensic evidence and the reality of a parallel federal criminal investigation, ultimately agreed to liquidate as part of a broader civil settlement negotiation, rather than risk a significantly worse outcome at trial. Diane, Ray's wife, who Michael and Sandra both eventually confirmed had no direct knowledge of or involvement in the fraud itself, filed for divorce roughly 2 months after the search warrant, a development that, when I heard about it, produced in me a complicated mixture of feelings I hadn't fully anticipated. A genuine, unexpected sympathy for a woman who I'd also known and cared about for most of my life, and who was now navigating her own version of discovering that decades of a shared life had been built, at least in part, on something false. The federal criminal case concluded roughly 10 months after the initial search warrant, with Ray pleading guilty to wire fraud and securities fraud charges rather than proceed to trial, given the overwhelming documentary evidence Sandra's forensic work and the FBI's own investigation had assembled. I attended the sentencing hearing, along with several of the other victim families, and gave a victim impact statement that I'd rewritten more times than I could count in the weeks leading up to it, trying to find language that captured both the financial devastation and the deeper, harder-to-articulate loss of watching a lifelong family friendship get exposed as, at minimum, a vehicle for sustained deception. I remember standing at that podium, looking out at a courtroom that included my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the Alvarezes, and a dozen other families I'd come to know over the preceding months, and choosing, in the end, not to focus my statement primarily on the dollar figures, which the court already had in exhaustive detail from Sandra's reports. Instead, I talked about the dining table. I described, as plainly as I could, 11 years of dinners, the pot roast, the bottle of wine Ray always brought, the specific, practiced warmth with which he'd explain fabricated numbers to two people who trusted him completely. And I told the judge that the true cost of what he'd done couldn't be fully captured in any restitution order, because some of what he took, the ordinary, unremarkable comfort of trusting an old friend without reservation, simply wasn't the kind of thing that could ever be paid back, no matter how the financial ledger eventually settled. Before the judge announced the sentence, Ray himself was given an opportunity to address the court, and I watched him turn, briefly, toward the section where the victim families were seated, and attempt something that was clearly meant to be an apology. He said he was sorry, that he'd never intended for it to grow the way it had, that he still cared about every single one of us. I remember feeling, in that moment, an unexpected wave of something almost like pity, quickly followed by a harder, clearer anger, because even in that supposed moment of accountability, his language kept circling back to what he had intended and felt, rather than to the specific, concrete harm he had caused. A pattern, Michael pointed out to me quietly afterward, that was entirely consistent with everything else we'd learned about him. Mrs. Henderson, sitting beside me, didn't cry during that part. She told me afterward that she'd used up all her tears for Ray months earlier, and that what she felt watching him speak was simply relief that it was, finally, almost over. Ray was sentenced to just over 9 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order covering the full documented losses across all 17 identified families, though Michael was careful to help everyone involved understand realistically that full restitution, given how much of the original money had simply been spent over 14 years, rather than preserved anywhere recoverable, was unlikely to ever be fully collected, even with a formal court order requiring it. The civil settlement, combined with the liquidated Sedona property and several other recovered assets, ultimately returned approximately 40 cents on every dollar my parents and the other families had originally invested. A genuinely painful, incomplete recovery, but one that Michael repeatedly reminded us was significantly better than the outcome in many comparable affinity fraud cases, where recovery rates are often far lower given how thoroughly the original funds tend to be dissipated by the time a scheme is finally uncovered. I want to be honest with you about how this settled inside me, because I think honesty matters more here than almost anywhere else in this story. There's a version of satisfaction in watching a federal investigation confirm, thoroughly and undeniably, exactly what Sandra found in those first 3 weeks. A 14-year fraud, formally documented, formally prosecuted, formally punished with real, meaningful consequences. I don't discount that satisfaction. It's real, and I earned it through months of careful, patient work that started with nothing more than an oddly vague phrase about several entities. But I also carry a genuine, complicated grief that no legal outcome, however thorough, was ever going to fully resolve. My father lost more than 40 years of friendship, not just to the fraud itself, but to the specific, devastating understanding that the friendship had, at some point along the way, become a tool rather than something real. That the dinners, the baseball coaching, the decades of warmth existed, at least in part, to maintain access to money that Ray was actively, knowingly stealing from people who loved him. I've watched my father, in the years since, become a slightly different, more guarded version of himself in some social situations, a change that I understand completely and still find quietly heartbreaking to witness in a man who spent most of his life being genuinely, easily trusting. My parents are managing, financially, on the roughly 40% recovery combined with their remaining Social Security income and a part-time consulting arrangement my father took on, at 77, that he never expected or wanted to need at this stage of his life. It's not the retirement they spent 40 years building toward, and I don't think there's any honest version of this story where I can tell you that part fully healed, even years later. My mother has, slowly, started hosting dinners again, though I've noticed she's more careful now about who she lets fully into the specific kind of trust that the dining table used to represent. What I do think matters, and what I've come to believe is the most important part of everything that happened, is that stopping this when I did prevented it from continuing for however many more years it might have taken to collapse entirely on its own. Years during which more families, more retirement accounts, more decades of trust would almost certainly have been drawn in and devastated. Several of the other victim families have told me, in the years since, that they believe the entire scheme could easily have continued another 5 or 6 years before collapsing under its own unsustainable weight, meaning the timing of Sandra's discovery, uncomfortable and painful as unraveling it was, likely spared a significant number of additional families from ever becoming victims at all. I've thought a great deal, in the time since, about what actually made the difference, why this particular scheme unraveled when it did, rather than continuing quietly for however many more years. I don't think it was any specific brilliance on my part. I think it was, more than anything, a willingness to sit with a small, uncomfortable, easily dismissible feeling of unease, that oddly vague phrase about several entities, instead of doing what would have been so much easier in the moment, which was simply accepting Ray's warm, familiar reassurance the way I had for the previous 11 years, and the way my parents had for even longer than that. I've come to believe that's really the entire lesson buried inside a story this large and this painful. Not that people should assume the worst about the people they love, but that a small, specific unease deserves a small, specific question, asked directly, before it gets talked back into silence by the comfort of history and affection. I stay in occasional contact now with several of the other families from the case. An unexpected, genuinely meaningful community that formed out of something so painful. People who understand, in a specific way almost no one else fully can, exactly what it means to have trusted someone that completely, for that long, and to have to rebuild both your finances and your understanding of your own judgment afterward. Mrs. Henderson and I still talk every few weeks, a friendship that exists now entirely independent of our parents' original connection, built instead on the strange, specific solidarity of having gone through this together. I've also become, somewhat unexpectedly, a resource for a handful of people outside this specific case. Friends of friends, acquaintances from my consulting work, who've heard some version of this story and reached out with quiet, uncertain questions about their own aging parents' finances, wondering whether they should look more closely at an advisor or arrangement that had never quite been fully explained to them. I always tell them the same thing I try to remind myself of, even now. Checking isn't the same as accusing. Asking to see an itemized breakdown of an investment, requesting confirmation of an independent custodian, looking up a registration in a public database, none of it requires believing the worst about someone you love. It simply requires believing that the people you trust most deserve transparency precisely because you trust them, not despite it. I wish, more than almost anything else that's come out of this entire experience, that I'd understood that distinction 11 years earlier, at that first careful, warm dinner conversation, instead of 3 weeks before everything finally came apart. My own kids are old enough now that they've absorbed a version of this story too, filtered down in the careful, age-appropriate way my husband and I chose to explain it. Not the full financial detail, but the shape of it, that someone their grandparents trusted for a very long time did something dishonest, and that Mom helped figure it out and helped make it right. My older daughter asked me once, with the particular bluntness of a 14-year-old, whether I'd ever trust anyone again the way my parents had trusted Ray. I remember sitting with that question longer than I expected to before answering her honestly, that I still believe, deeply, in trusting people, in building the kind of relationships that let you rely on someone without constantly bracing for betrayal, but that I've also learned, in a way I hope she never has to learn as painfully as I did, that real trust and blind trust aren't quite the same thing, and that the difference between them is usually just a willingness to ask a few careful questions along the way, even of the people you love the most. If someone in your life has ever used decades of trust as the exact tool to eventually take advantage of you, I hope this story reminds you that trust built over a lifetime doesn't automatically make someone trustworthy, and that asking careful, direct questions, even about people you love, is never a betrayal of that love. Sometimes it's the only thing that protects it. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire story tonight. I know it was a long one, and I'm genuinely grateful you gave it the time. If it moved you, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to Kaynaat Revenge, because next week I'll be back with another true-to-life story of betrayal and the patient, determined fight it took to finally uncover the truth.